Welcome to Putting It Together, the podcast that goes through the entire body of work of Stephen Sondheim, show by show and song by song. My name is Kyle Marshall, your self-described Sondheim expert. As I kind of mentioned last week, I am so excited to be jumping into the official season on Passion here now. This is song number 1. As you'll hear me describe, it has been very difficult to figure out exactly how to cut this show up to discuss it. Hopefully you're along for the ride because, as Sondheim points out in his book, he doesn't really consider there to be separate songs, but really just one long continuous piece that is broken up into scenes more than they are broken up into songs. So I'm mostly leaning on the original Broadway cast's ordering of how the songs are broken up. And then, of course, layering in some of the other recordings that are available. I do have to call out that unless something has changed very recently, at least on Apple Music, it's really just the original Broadway cast that's available to stream. Luckily, YouTube does have other versions of Passion available. I've been told that Spotify has different versions of Passion available, but I don't know why this is the one that has been the most difficult to find recordings of. One thing before we jump into this week's episode, I do want to read an email that was sent to me here this past week in regard to the special episode where I was having a discussion with Ari Axelrod. And he was mentioning about his concert that he's been performing and his album that is now available, of him combining You've Got to Be Carefully Taught with Children Will Listen. I thought that was such an interesting combination, being that Oscar Hammerstein is the teacher of Sondheim and they're kind of in conversation with each other. Bruce wrote in and told me, you may wish to mention that the pairing of You've Got to Be Carefully Taught and Children Will Listen is not new to Ari Axelrod. An earlier, very effective instance of this exists on Mandy Patinkin's album Oscar and Steve, and there may well be others. So thank you so much, Bruce, for keeping me honest. I actually was not aware of that, but good to know that this is an idea that other people have also had and executed it well. Lastly, I do want to apologize that this episode is going up fairly late. I usually like to post these Wednesday mornings. This is probably going up Thursday afternoon. Last week, I was spending time getting a grant application in, so it was taking a lot more of my time than I thought it was going to. It was taking a lot more time than I thought it was going to, and fingers crossed, I'll get some money to make my next short film this coming October. But so apologies there. I was still able to post 2 episodes last week, so hopefully that was a tide over until this week. But without further ado, let's get into this week's episode. Christine Chen, thank you so much for coming back.
Thank you so much for having me back on. I'm actually really excited to talk about Passion.
What a great segue to ask the very first question here. I mean, you've been here multiple times, so we kind of know your history with musical theater and Sondheim. I am very curious to know what your history with Passion is.
So to be honest, I didn't know it that well until a few months ago when I'm part of this sort of Sondheim group that meets every month or so. And it's kind of like a book club almost. We choose a topic to talk about. And one time Passion came up. And so I sort of took that as an excuse to do a dive into Passion. I watched the pro shot. I really hadn't known much about it before outside of the basic sketch of there's an ugly girl and, the main guy falls in love with her kind of thing. So, and it's sort of one of the Sondheims people seem really divided on. So I was really excited to take a look at that, and I thought it was just such an interesting show. I can definitely see how people don't like it, but I thought all the characters were really fascinating, and I really enjoyed the music and how it sort of comes in and out of the entire show and the way it's woven throughout. I think it's a really fascinating property.
Yeah, I believe it's in the book of Sondheim's collected lyrics, Look, I Made a Hat, where he mentions that the core idea he had was it to be essentially one long musical idea from start to finish, with the underscoring and lyrics coming in and out along with the book scenes. When you kind of hear that, or at least for me, you question is that something that can be sustained? But at least for this show, because of how self-contained it really is, there's not really, in my opinion, a lot of plot that it has to go through. It's really a lot of internal feelings that people are thinking or saying plainly out loud. So that song can weave in and out of the conversations that are happening here.
Right. Yeah, and he talks about it being like a epistolary musical where a lot of it and a lot of the major events happen through reading or writing letters. And that's also sort of how the music can be sustained and how it comes in and out and how events can be commented on. Because like there is plot and there are things that happen, but most of it is really about how the characters change and develop and learn new things as the show goes on.
And I would say that that is fairly true for each of the different iterations of this story that we've been looking at here this season. The original, 19th century Italian novella, the 1980s movie, and then this show that happens in the 1990s. Some things carry over throughout that. The letter writing, the long conversations. It's interesting to see the different, I guess, adaptations of this, of what they keep and what they kind of modify or throw away. But that core idea of writing letters back and forth about these conversations about love and romance and ugliness and beauty and stuff like that stays the same no matter what version we're watching or reading or interacting with. But to that point, I think we should, because this is the first episode talking about the show proper, is I think we should hit some of these characters. Maybe not Fosca for this episode because she isn't actually introduced here until much later, but I'm sure she'll come up here in our conversation. But in particular, I guess what your feelings or interpretations are of Giorgio and Clara.
Well, so first watching the show, and I think Sondheim also talks about this a little in his book when he talks about the Donmar production, where he mentioned they realized it was actually a story about Giorgio and not about Fosca.
Right.
Which I actually thought was kind of apparent from the pro shot of the original Broadway cast. I was like, oh, it's a coming of age story for Giorgio. Like in the beginning and in this song that I'm sure we'll talk about more in depth, he really thinks he has this idea of what happiness and love is. And he has his whole life settled, sort of. He knows what he likes. He's, having a relationship with this beautiful girl. He's like, this is the best that life will ever be. And then the whole progression of the show is about how he discovers what else love can be and like what are the different facets of like different types of love and different like what is quote unquote real love. And so I think it's really just a growing up story for him, really just discovering the world and all that.
I guess this epiphany that I had yesterday is that I guess it depends on each person's individual history of when this moment happens. Just to say, like, the blanket statement, it feels like a teenager's version of what they think love is,
right? Yeah,
versus an adult's version of what they know love is. Like it's that realization, that changing moment of like, oh, it's not just this one thing, it's this multifaceted thing that I have to contend with.
Yeah, exactly. And so I thought that was a really interesting story to talk about, because I feel like we hear it a lot where English doesn't have that many words for love. Like it's just love, whereas other languages might have more words for different types of love, familial love, all of that. And so this is sort of also investigating that. But also it's not like the show isn't called love, it's called passion. And that also adds another layer of like, what is it that Giorgio is actually experiencing and discovering, and sort of his entry into the world, and as he discovers there's more to life than just, like sleeping with Clara. So.
True. Specifically about Clara, though, what I think is so fascinating, like this is the one of only 2 times I think that she's technically really there. She's not just like an imagination or like we're just hearing from her letter type of thing.
Right.
She's literally there with Giorgio, interacting with him, which I do think is important to start the show off that way, so it's not just a figment of his imagination.
Yeah, and I actually think this might be a hot take. I think Clara is maybe the most interesting character in the show to me, because we know so little about her. Like obviously Fosca has a lot of depth and there's a lot to talk about and dig into there, but the way she's written, she kind of has to be a certain way. But Clara, depending on direction or depending on the actor, you could play her a whole number of ways. Like she could be this really young girl who's just dreaming of a true romance. It doesn't seem like she's that happy in her marriage. But she could also be like on the slightly older side, like world weary, having kind of given up on life and happiness until she met Giorgio. Like it could really go either way. there's a way you could sort of see her as kind of manipulative in the same way Fosca is, but because she's pretty and because she's more, like socially acceptable, it doesn't come off the same way that Fosca does. So I think she is just really interesting for like the different ways you could portray her, really.
Yeah, I mean, she's definitely the one that I think has the most, open to interpretation from the actor's point of view of like the three main people. I mean, Fosca continually calls her rival throughout this, right? Even though they never meet in this entire show. But it's, she feels like this idealized version to a certain degree. And I mean, this goes back to the book as well. Like you, the reader, would know they're never going to be together. Like this, it can't happen unless her husband mysteriously dies, which makes the story go into a very different direction. They can't be. That's just not an option for them. And Fosca herself, I guess, is not an option, quote unquote, but is more of an option for him than what Clara is. So I kind of agree that she's a fascinating person to dig into, depending on how you want to portray her.
Yeah, and I agree with what you were saying about how we only really see her twice in the show. Every other time she shows up, she is reading the letters that Giorgio wrote, but we don't know, or at least in the original staging, it's not made clear if it's like how he's imagining her reading his letters, or if it's her actually reading his letters. Like we don't know if how she's being portrayed is what she's actually doing or what Giorgio thinks she's doing. So there's also a lot of wiggle room there in terms of like who she actually is.
It definitely feels to me very similar to that sequence in Sweeney Todd where he's writing the letter to the wig maker type of thing, where, we're just hearing the letter sung back to us and not actually the character's reality that we're seeing. To that point, Sweeney Todd is brought up a lot of times in comparison to this show for a couple different reasons. One, it is essentially a sung through show.
Right.
And how a lot of people will kind of veer into considering this like an opera or a light opera of sorts, which Sondheim very much disagrees with. But I think that his hatred of opera shines through a little bit too much sometimes. I guess also based on the book. So I mean, it's like there are some of these similarities that are going through here. I don't know. Does that ring true to you that this is Sweeney Todd light in a way? I mean, it's not about murder or anything like that, but.
I mean, when you mention it, I can see why, because it feels like it's sort of painted with the same brushstroke. Like it's also dark and gothic in a way, but the content is so different. I mean, I guess you could say Sweeney also has a certain passion for revenge, but I think Sweeney sort of encompasses more of society at large, and also part of that was how Prince is doing, to be fair. But this is very, it's so like, you don't need the soldiers or the other people in the show, really. Like, it's really just about the three people at the center of it. And the other people are kind of just there to supply, like, plot machinations.
Sweeney is definitely more plot heavy than this, than this show.
So even though it's maybe cut from the same cloth, but they feel like very different shows to me. Like, I wouldn't have considered the Sweeney comparison until you brought it up, actually.
I do now want to mash up at some point with Sweeney Todd singing "Killing You Is Not a Choice, It's Who I Am."
Oh, that would be amazing.
What are your overall feelings of the show? Like, now that you've engaged with it a little bit more, where does this fit for you, I guess, in the Sondheim canon?
I really enjoy it. It just spoke to me in a way because I think it's so focused on the characters and sort of discovering love. And like, I'm also personally in a place, like I'm 29, so it's like not, I haven't lived like a big long life yet. And so this really, I think the ages of the characters really connected with me. I really enjoy it. I think it's definitely an underrated Sondheim. I think people who maybe didn't get it the first time, I would encourage them to come back to it again, or at least like try to see it in a different way, because I understand why maybe Fosca as a character is challenging, but I just think like the way that the show allows you to understand her and understand all the characters, really, it's like, I mean, that's just good theater, right? Like it's a story that you're sort of uncomfortable with if you just hear it on paper, but then once you see it, and and I think that's what drew Sondheim to the movie as well. Like, I just think there's such a depth of compassion for all the characters and just what they're going through.
Yeah, I guess to put it out there, if some people may not know this, the prevailing story is that people were like viscerally hating Fosca on stage, like cheered when she dies type of thing, like really did not like her. Sondheim writes about this, and he seems to indicate that that was really just through the preview period, that once it got past that was less of an issue. This still is, I don't know if it holds the record, but it's close, of the Tony Award for Best Musical running for the least amount of shows. I think it was like 6 months or something. It was not a full year that it ran for, let's put it that way. Yeah, I think at the time it was looked at much differently than what it is now, where it gets a bit of a reappraisal. But it's also one of those things when I watch the Pro Shot, I guess it's just hard for me to get into that mindset in the same way as like you listen to the Beethoven symphony that had like riots in the street because they dared to have people singing at the same time music was playing, and like people lost their minds. And now you listen to it and it's like, yeah, it's like a classical theater, it's classical music, and people are singing. Who cares? I feel it's kind of the same way when I interact with that. It's like, I mean, yeah, she's like, I guess at best like a morally great character. She is like a previous guest. I'll just borrow his descriptor, is a bit of a succubus as far as like her and Giorgio's relationship, but like, nothing that makes me like, oh my gosh, like this is the most hated character I'm seeing on stage now. She's complicated. She's interesting. I want to see more of their dynamic that goes through the show type of thing. So it's just hard for me to get into that mindset of what a 1994 audience was thinking at the time of watching it.
And I mean, I think we have a more of an appreciation for anti-heroes now and sort of like wanting to discover what's behind the psychology of people we consider like quote unquote bad people. And not that Fosca is a bad person. But she does do things that are morally questionable also. Right. But I think what is also funny about the show is if you handed it to like a different director, there is a really like melodramatic, campy way you could do the show where Fosca's just like popping up out of nowhere all of a sudden. Like it just like jump scares with Fosca showing up and like, you know, like.
Well, I mean, this is also the thing. And again, Sondheim and Lapine have both talked about this, about it was just something they could not really figure out in that original production, specifically because they cast Donna Murphy, who is a beautiful woman. Right. So to try and make her unappealing or quote unquote ugly was just a hard thing to try and do. It is something I will say that the movie does a little bit better with, because when she first shows up, she kind of looks like Nosferatu to me. She's like very sunken, like very vampiric type of like looking person that they soften as the movie goes on. But like that's her first introduction. Right. And then in the book, straight up says like, this is the most ugly woman I've ever seen in my entire life. Sometimes that's maybe hard to visually show off what they're trying to go for. I will say, just for my own thing, just to answer my own question, is like this is definitely one of the Sondheim shows I got into last, because it was released later on, but also the first time I listened to it, I don't know if I really got it, but I was like late teens, early 20s at the time. So I don't know if I just fully understood what was even happening or what the show was trying to do. But over the years, it's one that I keep going back to like over and over and over again. And some of the individual moments, even though I know we're supposed to think of this as a one long musical piece, but there's individual moments that happen that are like so gorgeous and so great to listen to. There's like, oh, this is like up there in the top tier for me, at least.
I think as a score too, the whole score comes together like, and that's partially how it's constructed, but it's just like every song that I don't really think there's one that stands out that much from the others. And it all just flows like musical so well.
Things that happen throughout the entire score too, where they keep referring back to.
And there's not like, if I'm listening to the cast album, then there's not really a song that I skip or a song that I'm like excited to get to necessarily. It's just like, I just want to listen to this whole thing and be immersed in the sound of this musical again, which I don't think is really the case for almost any of his other scores. Like even Sweeney Todd, when it's almost sung through, like I'm like, you know, I could skip this round of the ballad, or you know.
Yeah, but, there's a few that you can skip past. I was like, I don't need to hear this right now.
But this one, I think it works so well as a complete piece.
This is, I mean, to pull back the curtain a little bit, it has also been the hard part of like organizing this season of like what is considered a song and what is considered a scene, because in sometimes book he just breaks it down scene by scene rather than having song titles on it. But then on the record, then they actually have like song titles that they've broken down. It's been tough to figure out like, okay, how do I actually break this apart?
But then the song titles are like third letter, and you're like, all right.
Yeah, it's like, all right. But as people will see, I'm going to be combining a lot of those letter songs all together rather than doing it one by one. Hey everyone, just Kyle breaking into the conversation to tell you about some of the people that help this show continue to go. If you'd like to help support this show for absolutely free, you can give a rating and review on whatever app you listen to podcasts in. That's of course greatly appreciated. Putting It Together is an independent podcast, so if you'd like to help monetarily, which will only help to grow and make this show better, you can do so over at our Patreon page. That's patreon.com/puttingittogetherpodcast. Please do not donate if it impacts you negatively financially. I also need to give a huge thank you to the God That's Good tier on Patreon. That's Alex, Barry, Christopher, David, Jack, Louise, Michael, Mika, Robert, Stephen, and Whitty. All right, let's get back to the show. Okay, so to get into what we're talking about today, what song are we talking about here today?
We are talking about the first song, which is Happiness.
Yeah, this is, well, Sondheim finally gets to orchestrate an orgasm in a song. Something that he had tried to do in Sweeney Todd, but they cut the judge's Joanna. This is all he ever wanted. I guess after a bit of a military march, what we're supposed to understand with the sting that's happening and what's happening on stage with the two people in bed together is like, that is how this song starts, is Clara having an orgasm. So I guess quite the way to open up a show.
Is. For 1994 audience, bet they weren't expecting that.
Do you have anything, I guess, specifically to say about that? It's like military march, sting, and then we actually get into like lyrics singing back and forth. But I guess just as a start to a show, anything that you want to bring up there?
Yeah, it's a line that Fosca says later where she says, they hear drums, we hear music. And that's sort of how the show starts, is like the drums lead into the music of the show. And the drums are prevailing throughout, and a lot of it is set in a military setting, but it's sort of, I guess, showing Giorgio's difference to his other military peers, but also just like, here is the music amongst such strict military backdrop. Like, we later find out he's very different from the other soldiers and everything. And so it kind of, I guess, brings us into the world of Giorgio. But what I found interesting in both the novel and the movie, neither of which I actually finished, to be fair, was that the novel is told as a memoir from 5 years after the fact. And then the movie also, in the beginning, it's like an older Giorgio narrating, like, when I first saw Clara. But they decided not to go that route with this musical. We just,
it's like all like
here they
real
are.
Time.
Yeah. But I think that this sort of transition does kind of give us the backdrop of maybe a little glimpse of what's going on outside of this little love nest that they have going on. So I think it's effective in that way. But it's kind of a weird opening number, isn't it? Like, the first thing you see on stage is just...
First thing you see, like two naked bodies. A melody, I will say, like when we actually get into like the quote-unquote melody, I guess, of this song, is one that goes through the entire score. Like we keep coming back to this idea of happiness. I was just going to say, before I forget it, this is the thing that is so classically this old idea of like, oh, like they're really different. Do you know that they read? Like that's what makes him weird, which I think is so funny. It's like the 1980s equivalent of like, wait, you can't be hot. You wear glasses. It's like, it's just like, what are you talking about?
You're actually, you think?
Yeah, I know. It's so funny to me. Okay, so Clara's the first one who starts singing, and I will say this is very conversational. I'm so happy, I'm afraid I'll die here in your arms. What would you do if I died like this, right now, here in your arms? That we ever should have met is a miracle. And then Giorgio says, no, inevitable. Then inevitable, yes. But I confess it was the look, the sadness in your eyes that day when we glanced at each other in the park. Then Giorgio says, we were both unhappy. Unhappiness can be seductive. And Giorgio says, you pitied me. And they both go, how quickly pity leads to love.
I'm so happy, I'm afraid I'll die here in your arms. What would you do if I died like this right now here in your arms? That we ever should have met is a miracle.
No, inevitable.
Then inevitable, yes, but I confess it was
the look,
the sadness in your eyes, that day when we glanced at each other.
We were both unhappy.
Unhappiness can be seductive.
You pitied me. How quickly pity leads to love.
I will just say, as kind of a opening statement in a way. It's interesting how much that conversation is like the basis in the entire rest of the show.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's that sort of, I don't know if you call it a theory, where the first line of the show should give you an idea of the entire show. And the first line here is, I'm so happy, I'm afraid I'll die, which does come into play with Fosca later, and how how her arc climaxes for a certain term. But I think it does do a pretty good job of setting up these two characters. But what I always find funny about this song is it makes you think that Clara is a much bigger character in the show than she kind of ends up being. Like, you think that the major conflict is going to happen between Clara and Giorgio, and not like Fosca doesn't even show up until like 4 songs in or something.
Yeah, something like that.
All the stuff they're talking about is sort of the concepts that will come into play in the rest of the show. And even just like the way that the two characters talk to each other about their meeting. Clara thinks it's a miracle. Giorgio thinks it's inevitable. I think that also shows a bit about where they are in their life and how they choose to see things. Like Clara, which we later will find out, and we don't actually know at this point yet, is married already, has a son, and is conducting this affair with Giorgio. And so for this idea that she thinks it's a miracle, it's sort of like something that pulls her out of her mundane life. But Giorgio thinks it's inevitable. He believes in like, this is my destiny. This is sort of something like we were always meant to be together. It's a little bit more romanticized, I guess. And she's just like, yeah, whatever you say, it's inevitable. Okay, we'll go with that.
Sure. I mean, I like how you bring that up. You can really see that through these lyrics and how they're singing back and forth the different points in their lives, where Giorgio, I think, is in that mentality of like, there's only one love for each person. And like, so it was inevitable that we find each other eventually here, right? It was fate that brought us together. And I think she's much more practical. I'm like, well, I mean, there's a lot of like the ones out there. So, and you just happen to be one of them here right now. But I like these little bits of like character development that are not throwaway lines, but you can like blink and you'll miss them, which is like the sadness in your eyes, like just saying that, like, I could see that you were not mentally healthy. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting how they say unhappiness can be seductive, because I feel like that's something only an unhappy person would say. Like, if you're a happy person and you see an unhappy person, you're like, man, they're such a drag, you know, like you're not really trying to be around them as much. But if you are unhappy and you see someone else that's unhappy, you kind of feel a kinship there. You're like, around all these other happy people, like, at least we can be unhappy together. So
we're being real, man. All right.
Yeah, exactly. Like, those are fake people.
I think that's actually a really strong thing to say. There's something to be said about toxic positivity, which I do think can absolutely be a thing and happen. But the reverse of that is like, you're not supposed to be miserable your entire life either. I mean, like, we do have this weird, like, idea that if you're an artist or something like that, you're supposed to be like a tortured person and a tortured soul your entire life, or if like only real people understand that it's like sadness is what needs to happen, right? As if that's more real than being happy occasionally.
Yeah. And then, of course, we get to the how quickly pity leads to love, which is also a little bit questionable for them to say. But it is something that also comes back into play later with Fosca and how...
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I don't want to take too much away from your other guests who will probably talk about this, but the way that Giorgio becomes fascinated with Fosca, and he can't seem to really tear himself away from her. Like, even Clara is like, hey, you keep talking about this girl. Like, what's up with that? So you do see this fascination sort of coming out of that. But then that's also how his relationship with Clara developed, is she saw him, I think in the book, he's coming off of a sick leave or something. And so he also was in like a place of not great health. And it's sort of like her health, and I think he calls her robustness, was what really drew him to her.
You seem like healthy, so I am now attracted to you.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, well, Clara gets to sing what I'm calling like the melody of this song. Although I love what Sondheim writes here. Actually, I'll just read it out here. The way that this is structured, obviously, right, that there's just a lot of like sung dialogue, essentially. But to keep this song from morphing into recitative, I sprinkled the lyric with occasional rhymes and even included what the actor Anthony Perkins, a man with an antic sense of language, liked to call a songette, the section centering on the refrain word happiness. So this is our songette. All this happiness, merely from a glance in the park. So much happiness, so much love. Giorgio says, I thought I knew what love was. And Clara goes, I wish we might have met so much sooner. I could have given you my youth. And Giorgio is saying, I thought I knew what love was. I thought I knew how much I could feel all this time we lost. I didn't know what love was. I'll never know what love was. But now, I do. It's what I feel with you. The happiness I feel with you.
All this happiness, merely from a glance in the park. So much happiness, so much love.
I thought I knew what love was.
I wish we might have met so much sooner. I could have given you
what love was.
my youth.
I thought I knew how much I could feel.
All the time we lost.
I didn't know what love
I
was.
never knew what love was.
But now,
and now I do. It's what I feel with you. The happiness I feel with you.
I think the most striking part is they're just sort of talking past each other. It's not like the kind of relationship where they are on the same page. They're both sort of saying what they think and like want out of this relationship, and they're not the same things. They're just not even listening to each other, really. It's not like, oh, let me give you a chance to speak like what you want to say, and then I'll, say my part. They're totally ignoring each other almost and what the other is trying to say.
I think the most revealing thing here because he doesn't really react to it because he's seeing his own part, right? Of, I thought I knew what love was until meeting you. But Clara's saying, like, I could have given you my youth, essentially indicating, again, in 19th century standards, like she's an old woman, which probably means she's like 28. But like,
Right.
I actually think in the book she's 30. I
think she's 25, actually. She's younger than Giorgio.
Oh, you're right. I think you are right. Yeah. But regardless, it's like she's old, but she should give her youth, which was 5 years ago.
I mean, that also sort of brings me to like the different ways Clara could be played, because if she is like, obviously she's still young, but like the musical I think could do with either an older Clara or a younger Clara. And for a younger one, I mean, knowing in hindsight that she has a husband and a child, she could also be saying like, I wish you were my first love. I wish like, we could have been married, or we could have been whatever. But on the other side, it could also just be like she likes daydreaming about this like grand romance that they're having, and it may not be actually true. Like it may just be, stuff you say in bed, and more a romanticized version than what she necessarily feels. So again, it can be played like so many different ways because she is still quite young. Like, I mean, I don't think you could really play her as like much over 30 really, but you could still go like early 20s, late 20s. Like, I feel like all of that would still work.
Even though I was being a bit cheeky there before, the way that I've always understood that to mean is more so like, she has a husband and kid. She wished she had met him before she had a husband and kid. That's just an elegant way of saying saying that phrase. But yeah, I think you're right. I think playing around with exactly where she is in her life is an interesting way to go about this.
Yeah. And also the other thing I want to bring up here is that Sondheim always talks a lot about how he doesn't really like people singing in unison because he doesn't think that people are ever thinking the exact same things at the same time. But here it's like, the part where they talk about happiness is the part where they actually come together and sing the same lines. And so they're both kind of like, I don't really care what the other person is saying, but we're happy, right? And so that's like the part that they do agree on.
Yeah, I think it's very indicative of the fact that they do sing together quite a bit here in this opening song, that at least they're on the same page from that perspective, that they are happy with each other.
Yeah.
That cannot be denied, I guess, here in this case. So we continue on, and Clara begins this back and forth. So much happiness, you are so beautiful, happening by chance in a park, not by chance, by necessity. Surely this is happiness, by the sadness that we saw in each other. No one else has ever felt before, and they both come together. Just another love story, that's what they would claim. Another simple love story, aren't all of them the same? And Clara says, no, but this is more, we feel more. And they both say, this is so much more like every other love story.
So much happiness.
You are so beautiful.
Happening by chance in a park.
Not by chance, by necessity.
Surely this is happiness.
By the sadness that we saw in each
No
other.
one else has ever felt before.
Just another love story, that's what they would claim. Another simple love story, aren't all of them the same?
No, but this is more, we feel more.
This is so much more, like every other love story. Some say...
Is this like every other love story?
I guess we'll find out in the show. I do really like that line because I think it's also something that young people, when you're like really young and in your first relationship or so, you tell yourself, you're like, no one could ever understand what I'm feeling. Like this is different from anything else. And in a way, I guess it's true because, you know, those two people have never been in love with each other before. But also it's kind of like, okay, well, I think in the entire history of humankind, there might be someone who has an idea of what you're feeling.
Exactly.
So, yeah. But also the way that it's broken up, the way that she says, oh, surely this is happiness. And in the lyric book, it's surely this is happiness. And that's broken up with Giorgio's line. But then it continues to be, surely this is happiness no one else has ever felt before. Mm-hmm. But the fact that it's broken, like, it feels deliberate that way, where Clara is trying to almost convince herself, too, that it is happiness. Like, maybe she doesn't feel it as strongly as, you know, as she is implying that it is. It almost also sounds like they're trying to convince themselves a little too much. Like, we're happy. We're so happy, right? And it also reminds me of So Happy from Into the Woods, too, where they're oh, you know, like, I could use a bigger house, but no, we're happy. We're totally happy. And so it's just like these little things that maybe show a little bit of friction in their relationship. And again, like how they don't necessarily agree.
I think what it's really pointing towards, to like fully spoil the end, not that I think anyone would probably be listening to this that has not watched all the way through this show, but like ultimately because she breaks things off.
Right.
With Giorgio, right? To me, this feels like this is different, but different is not the same as happiness. You know what I mean? Like she obviously is not being fulfilled necessarily with her husband and the life that she's currently living. And I do think that Giorgio and her are meeting at a very specific time that they, you know, feed off of each other or intertwine with one another. But ultimately, she knows that this probably is not going to be sustainable.
Yeah. And it also, like, they have this exchange again where she says it happened by chance and he says, no, it's not chance, it's necessity. And so she's really just seeing this as like, oh, hey, I happened to come upon this and, like, you know, I'm getting probably temporary happiness from this based on this chance that happened. And Giorgio's like, no, this is necessity. This is what was meant to happen. Like, again, they're in different places about it. And she seems like she probably knows that this is not going to end up the way that he wants it to end up.
Right. So they continue singing together, singing Some Say Happiness Comes and Goes. Then this happiness is a kind of happiness no one really knows. Giorgio says, I thought I knew what love was. And Clara says, I'd only heard what love was. Giorgio goes, I thought it was no more than a name for yearning. I thought it was what kindness became. And Giorgio says, I'm learning. I thought where there was love was shame. That with you, but with you, there's just happiness, endless happiness.
Some say happiness comes and goes. Then this happiness is a kind of happiness no one really knows. I thought I knew what love was. I thought it was no more than a name for yearning.
I thought it was what kindness became.
I'm learning
I thought where there was love, there was shame.
that with you
But with you,
there's just
happiness, endless happiness.
Where there was love, there was shame is an interesting thing that she admits to here.
And I think it's like almost the most that we ever get out of her about her relationship with her husband or even any other prior romantic relationship. But it's also funny because she's saying that in past tense, but obviously what we'll find out is they can only meet on afternoons for fear of her husband discovering them. She can't really like truly be with Giorgio or like even see a sunrise with him or spend the night. So there is still shame there. And it's not like, oh, we can be out and open and everything. So it's not quite true in the way that she's saying it. Yeah, it is also just like, oh, how did she end up here? Like, why is this her view on love?
On the flip side, I think that the interesting part that Giorgio admits to is like, I thought that it was no more than a name for yearning, meaning like, I thought love was just what you called unreciprocal, like adoration type of thing. I love that, like for yearning. And then he says, oh, I'm learning, when she admits that she thinks it was what kindness became, which is another interesting thing that she says, that love is what kindness becomes. So you're first kind and then that grows into love, which is an interesting concept too.
And that sort of goes back to the pity part. Like pity leads to love. When you pity someone, you might be kind to them. And then that's sort of what grows out of that, which again is also kind of what happens with Giorgio and Fosca later. Clara kind of knows what's up. And Giorgio is there to learn that. So yeah, like that's also again two very different ideas of what love is. But also I want to go back to the earlier part with the some say happiness comes and goes. Then this happiness is a kind of happiness no one really knows, because I mean, happiness does come and go. It's not something, you can't be relentlessly happy all the time.
You cannot sustain that forever.
And so the fact that they're trying to tell themselves that, yes, we're always going to be happy. No one else knows like what this is like. And again, with the idea that they can't be together properly. They have to only have afternoons and hiding out in like a little cottage and stuff. It's just not something that is actually grounded in the realities of their relationship.
Yeah, I mean, it still seems like even with what they're admitting to and like their interactions with each other in this bed that they're rolling around in, that they still have this like idealized version of what love is. I mean, I think Clara reveals that she's probably much more realistic in what her outlook is throughout this song, but I still think they both have these idealized versions of what happens, I guess. I don't know. And
it's one of those things where I think Giorgio actually does believe this is like real love. This is what he's been going for his whole time. But with Clara, it's like, sometimes it's nice to sort of disappear into that fantasy of like the idealized love, like whether or not she knows it's idealized is, I think, a way that you can sort of delve into her character more. Sometimes it's like, oh yeah, I want to believe this, so I'll say it's true. Or it could just be like, oh, this is actually something that's new to me and that I want to happen. Like it could really go either way.
I also wonder too, again, this is an acting choice, I think, more than anything than the lyrics specifically indicate, but her thing about like, I thought it was what kindness became, to me, and again, I could be reading way too much into this, seems to indicate that that's not what she feels with her husband.
Right.
You know what I mean? Is like, anyways, yeah, just an interesting admission here on her part. I think she loves her child, at least from,
for sure.
Again, the show, the book, the movie and everything. I think that's made very, very clear, but I never get a good sense of what she actually feels about her husband.
Right. And, you know, maybe it was an arranged marriage, maybe it was something else. But the idea that, like, I mean, and maybe she was in love with her husband and then got tired of him, or like it wasn't like, you know, like that could all be true. But yeah, I think there's a way where she has idealized this other version of love that comes from kindness, and maybe her husband isn't kind to her. And that's why she likes Giorgio so much.
Or, I mean, the other way you could read this too, because of the fact that she says, I thought it was what kindness became. It could be like, maybe, her husband was kind to her, but there was never that passion behind their relationship, which is what she's feeling with Giorgio in this moment.
Yeah.
So anyways, the Clara's out there. Tell us what how you approach this. So then there's this small book scene here. It's not like super, super long, but essentially Giorgio reveals the fact that he's being restationed. He's going off to another military base, and they're going to have to keep this up via letters. It's not a super long train ride away, but still, it's not something that they can like meet up every day sort of thing like they have been. And so then they draw back together, and Giorgio goes, God, you are so beautiful. I love to see you in the light, clear and beautiful. Memorize every inch, every part of you to take with me Your feet so soft as if they've never touched the ground. Your skin so white, so pure, so delicate. Your smell so sweet. Your breath so warm. I will summon you in my mind. I'm painting you indelibly on my mind. We must fill every moment. However, throughout that, Clara is saying, no, Giorgio, don't, let me go.
Yeah.
So,
You are so beautiful. I love to see you in the light, clear and beautiful. Memorize every inch, every part of you to take with me.
Giorgio.
Your feet so soft, as if they'd never touched the ground.
Don't.
Your skin so white, so pure, so delicate.
Not now.
Your smell so sweet, your breath so warm. I will summon you in my mind. I'm painting you indelibly on my mind.
Let me go.
We must fill every moment.
All this happiness.
I mean, it's like what Sondheim said about originally writing Maria as a love song. He doesn't actually say, Giorgio, doesn't actually say anything here that is specific to Clara. He only says, oh, she's beautiful. He mentions her soft feet, her skin, her smell. It's all things that kind of could be anyone, really.
Right.
And it's all things that I think are things that he, as a soldier, wouldn't be used to seeing often in like soldiers' barracks and stuff like that. It's kind of like his escape from the military life. It also is sort of like, oh, does he actually like her as a person, or is it just like what she represents to him? And we find out he's like one of those like tortured souls who loves books and actually reads and
Right.
Appreciates beauty in a way that the other soldiers don't. So is this just part of that, or is this actually something that he cares about? And he's trying to comfort her. He's not saying like I'll miss you and like how you do this and how you do. It's just, oh, I'll miss the view of you, really.
Yeah. That is actually, another great point that you just brought up here is like Sondheim is always really good at letting you know kind of what the character's true feelings are by the way that they order things that they sing about. And here it's all beauty based, right? It's all a surface level. It's like, it's your feet, it's your skin, it's your smell. So it's like, there's nothing about it's like, I like you as a person. Like, I like how you challenge me, or I like how we talk about stuff. It's just like what you look like and what you smell like, which again is like so surface level and is very much, I think, a young man's version of what love is. It's only appearance based. That's the only thing that they can kind of focus on.
So, and it's just like this for him, I think, is something that he sort of needs in his life to hold on to, because he seems like he was really, they even say it, he was very unhappy before he met her. And this is sort of like his last grasp at like being happy and like what he sort of needs to tell himself that he is happy.
All right. Well, this is how the song ends here. I love this stage direction because it says, Clara beginning to cry, all this happiness, ended by a word in the dark. And Giorgio goes, oh, my love, oh, my darling. Clara goes, so much happiness wasn't meant to last. Giorgio goes, I am here. I am with you. I am yours. Clara, I never knew what love was. And Giorgio goes, your skin, your silken hair. I always thought I didn't deserve it. And Giorgio, your breasts, your lips. Clara, I didn't know what love was. And Giorgio goes, I want you every minute of my life. And Clara goes, I don't know how I'll live when you're gone. And Giorgio kind of envelops her and says, I'll always be here. And Clara goes, I don't know how I'll live. Giorgio, don't leave me. And then she orgasms again. So good for Giorgio, I suppose.
All this happiness ended by a word in the dark.
Oh, my love, oh, my
so
darling.
Much happiness wasn't meant to last.
I am here, I am with you, I am
never knew what
yours.
love was.
Your skin, your
I
silken
always thought I
hair,
did
your
deserve
breasts,
it.
your lips. I
didn't
want you
know
every
what
minute of my
love
life.
was. I don't know how I'll live when you're gone.
I will always be
I don't
here.
know how I'll live. Giorgio, don't leave me.
I just think it's funny how Clara's like, this is the worst thing to happen to me. And Giorgio's like, but I'll remember your breasts, you know? Like,
I know. It's just like, it's like, you dummy. Like, what are you doing?
Yeah. So he really doesn't have, like, as well read as he is, he just doesn't seem to have the emotional capacity to like understand her yet.
Which again, so to your point, is kind of the whole point of the show, because ultimately he will understand what all this means.
Yeah. Yeah. And Clara just like does not seem that interested in a correspondence relationship. She's like, if you're not here, what's the point? So, which I understand, because it's also kind of like, oh, well, what drew her to him was like kind of this very physical relationship, we can assume. And if he's not physically there, then like she's still back where she started. Now she just has someone to write letters to, I guess. Which doesn't really take up that much of your day if she really is just like, you know, looking lost and looking for purpose in her life. So
yeah, you write like 2 paragraphs. What does that take you? Like 20 minutes with quill and ink. You spray it with some perfume and you send it off. Easy.
Yeah. So maybe she takes a long time spraying it with perfume, because they always comment on it. So yeah. Yeah. And then also the whole so much happiness wasn't meant to last. It is kind of coming back to what we were talking about earlier with she probably knows that this was never going to be a real relationship, but she also didn't really expect it to end this soon. I think, oh yeah, he says that he has to leave in 5 days. So less than a week.
I will say this is partly the difference of reading the lyrics out like this versus like watching the actual stage production, because I think just reading the lyrics out makes it so obvious that like, oh, they're saying this up, that this is just, that this can't last. And yet when I watch it, it's like, yeah, they are happy. It feels like so romantic in this moment, like is the swelling of the orchestra and all that kind of stuff.
And so much of this, like that we've been talking about with how they're not on the same page, how they're, you know, just talking past each other. Like you don't really see that when you watch it for the first time. You're just like, oh, these two people, they're so happy and they're so, you know, they have this very loving relationship. But then when you come back to it, you're like, oh, you can see the cracks in their relationship. And also again, back to this as an opening number, like you think this is the main conflict, that Giorgio is going away and that Clara is going to be sad without him. You think that like maybe the show is going to reorient, so like how do they get back together, or like what happens to them,
I
like
think
how sad they're going to be.
This is like the major difference between if this was an original story being written like today versus, you know, when the original story was written, because I feel like if this was a story like, again, written right now in the year 2025, you would have to have these two women meet each other and like fight it out or duke it out or do something with each other, or at least have a confrontation of some kind. And I do think actually this is a much richer piece because they don't do that. The conflict is Giorgio having to combat his feelings between these two women. It's not a story about two women fighting over a man.
Yeah. And it's just like two women that represent very different things, and neither of them are perfect, because, you know, again, when you discover that Clara is having an affair with Giorgio, can't even see him at night, it's like, oh, is that the kind of love he wants? Because at first when you see Fosco, you're like, yeah, go back to Clara. But later on, you realize the situation's a lot more complicated. And I think that's sort of what's genius about this piece is how it unfolds and just keeps adding different levels of complications. And like, so there is no truly like correct path anymore. And you kind of lose sense of like, oh, actually, do I want him to be with Clara? Like, they were happy, but were they? So, yeah.
Well, I guess to kind of lead into our wrap-up discussion here, first and foremost, like when you take a look at the entirety, I guess, of this score as it is, how would you rate this song? Like, where would it fall for you?
I think probably the upper half, at least, just because some of the things like the Soldier's Gossip and all of that, they're fun songs, but it's not stuff that I think is like really as interesting.
And oftentimes I will say, like, we'll talk about it in future episodes, but like the Soldier's Gossip especially, it's always just like a redo of something that either Fosco or someone else has said in the previous scene, it feels like. So it's like, yeah, but I think again, like the way that it shows the characters, I think it does sound really lovely. It's probably one of the few songs you could pull mostly out of context and do at like a cabaret show or something. I think it's definitely near the top half, maybe even top 5, honestly, but I'd have to enumerate them. I think it's a really great song, both in the
way that it sounds. Like I really love parts of the melodic lines, the songettes or whatever he calls them that are within this, and just like it does feel sweeping, but then, you know, as we dove into the lyrics, it shows a little more under the surface.
My final question I'm going to do this season, I know you're at a disadvantage because you're the first recording that I'm doing, so you haven't heard what my final question is here. You can take this in whatever way you want, although
Right.
I realized that this might sound personal, and I don't mean it that way, but so take this any way you want right now, because the show is called Passion and it involves people's passions. Right now, what would you consider the thing that you're most passionate about?
Oh, of course, musical theater. That's an easy one. I mean, it'll be interesting to see what your other guests say, but that easily is my top thing.
Have you been keeping up with the new Broadway season?
Yeah, I
Anything
mean,
that is standing out for you currently?
maybe Happy Ending. I did really enjoy. I don't know how much you've heard about it, but the pitch is robots falling
Is it
in
the
love.
robots?
Yeah.
Music? Yeah, okay.
But it like, and I feel like that always gives kind of the wrong connotation. Like what I describe it is like robots falling in love, but the robots are like a Pixar / Studio Ghibli version of, like, that's the vibe of the show. It's just very sweet and really wholesome, and it's not really like the like android kind of robots. They look like humans. They're domestic servants kind of thing.
I'm interested in checking it out. I've been waiting because I've heard some good things about it from other people too. I'm just waiting for a recording to come out so I can actually listen to the music.
There's 4 songs out on YouTube right now.
Oh, okay. Maybe I should check those out.
Yeah, if you look on their YouTube channel, I think they have a playlist with them. And they have announced a cast recording, but not a date, which is kind of annoying because I also really want it. Yeah, that I think is one of the best, because it's also a completely original musical. It's not really based on anything, which, you know, like, I don't think that should be the qualifier for what makes a good musical, but I think I was really impressed at how they came up with the world and all the characters and everything. It's a lovely character piece.
That's cool. Anything that you're the most excited about that's coming out?
Let's see. What else is coming up?
I'm trying to remember if I know what's coming out.
Yeah. There's always so many now. I can never remember them all. Oh, I'm curious about the new, like, what they're doing with Smash. Because I watched the TV show a while ago. They just released the like recording session for Let Me Be Your Star, which is one of the big songs from Smash, but they're repurposed it as an opening number, so it sounds different. And that actually...
And the rest of the songs are new to the show? Am I right on that? Or are they all from the TV show?
I think they're all from the show. I'm not sure if they're writing new songs. But this one that they released, they definitely wrote new lyrics and have a different arrangement for, which really intrigued me. And I think they did a really good job with it. So that definitely got me really excited. But the thing is, the plot is apparently almost completely different from the TV show. So it really could go either way. I was like, I don't know. So that I'm excited about, just as a big question mark. Of course, on a Sondheim podcast, I have to mention Old Friends, which is the Sondheim review with Bernadette Peters and Lea Salonga and a bunch of other people. So that's going to be really exciting. I do already have tickets to that one.
Oh, good.
So, yeah, those are 2 I'm looking forward to.
If people wanted to stay in contact with you and see what you're up to, what's the easiest way to do so online?
I guess I haven't really been posting much online. The best is probably still on Twitter at Across the Arch. The other main thing I do is a podcast on new musicals each Broadway season called Bottomless Broadway. And you can also find that on any podcast platform you want as well.
Any word when that's returning? When is
Yeah. So what's happening is that all these new musicals aren't starting until March. So we kind of have run out of content. We've already started recording, actually, our first couple episodes, which will probably be released sometime in February or March. But we did an episode for Sunset Boulevard, the revival, which I'm actually really excited about, because I think that is also a fascinating piece of theater, what they did with it.
Yeah, I like it when revivals do something drastically different.
Yeah, and
approach it in a
it's
different
so
way.
Crazy that we might even do that as 2 episodes, because we were talking for a long time about that.
Sure.
And then we also recorded Maybe Happy Ending already. On the docket, we have Death Becomes Her and Swept Away as well.
Oh, right.
Which Swept Away already closed, but I think there's enough to talk about for an episode. And then I guess we'll see how the spring season shakes up, because it's so hard to tell what musicals are and aren't going to survive and all of that. But
exactly.
You know, we'll see. So stay tuned.
Cool. Great. Thank you, Christine.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much for listening. You can send emails to puttingittogetherpodcast@gmail.com. You can also follow Sondheim Podcast on either Twitter or Instagram, although I haven't posted for about a year, but you can do that. This is an independent production, and you can support the show on Patreon by going to patreon.com/puttingittogetherpodcast. Putting It Together is available on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, and pretty much anywhere you get podcasts from. Consider subscribing so that you never miss an episode. Next week, we're going to be talking about letters 1 through 4. I'm probably just going to send a text. As always, a big thank you to the great Chris Taniguchi, who designed the podcast artwork, and to Nick Driscoll for composing our theme music. Well, we've reached the end of our episode. Yes, I know. Goodbye for now.